I am Shavanah, the General Secretary of the Wales TUC, and I wanted to just provide you with a couple of opening comments, really. So first of all, of course, I'd like to start by offering our sincere thanks to Professor Jean Jenkins for her report. Jean is an internationally recognised expert on labour rights, and we are immensely grateful that she agreed to take this project on. Not an easy thing to do at all. And this report really is the final outcome of a process that began with the resolution at the Wales TUC Congress back in 2022. Now, our unions felt that it was absolutely essential that we refreshed our approach to devolution and that we took a bit more of an active part in the lively debates around what was happening and what should happen next. And this became even more important to us with the Welsh Government's decision to establish its own independent commission that's been headed up by Professor Laura McAllister and Darren Williams. And I've also had the privilege of sitting on that commission, and we are looking forward to the publication of that report come next week. Now, we commissioned Jean in order to provide her expertise and independent view, and that's exactly what she's actually done. Now, the report is up on our website. It's available both in English and in Welsh, of course, and I would encourage each and every one of you to read it in full. There's lots of details in there around the real challenging realities and some of the contradictions of the Welsh labour market, where we, see relatively low unemployment, but high economic inactivity, low productivity, and really stagnant wages and growing insecurity as well. And, this, it presents a nuanced analysis, this report, of some of the issues on the potential devolution of employment rights. Again, it's one of those things that comes up time and time again. And of course, it is important to note that the Wales TUC is a long-standing supporter of devolution, and the Welsh Government, of course, has consistently fought for workers since it was established. Now, whether that's through pioneering legislation like the more recent Social Partnership Act, or by standing with us against the UK government attacks on workers. There are, of course, unquestionably lots of risks associated with further devolution without adequate funding. We know that. There are lots of challenges, of course, around where devolution would leave things like collectively bargaining contracts in particular that have been agreed at a UK level. And actually, where is it that workers stand? Well, workers are almost evenly split on this issue in relation to whether or not we should see the devolution of employment rights. So we welcome the recommendation that the Wales TUC will next, of course, establish a working group to look at the practicalities of devolution of employment rights. And we look forward to discussing the report, not just in the coming weeks, but also at our Congress meeting in May, when we will be looking to agree a shared union position on the future of devolution and work. Now, we're going to be hearing, we're going to have some responses as well from members of our General Council and people from our union movement, in particular from Darren Williams of PCS and Richie Lewis of UNISON Cymru as well. But first of all, I'd like to hand over to Jean to take us through some of the key aspects of the report. Over to you, Jean.
Thank you, Shavanah, and thanks very much. A huge thank you for inviting me to do this work. It was I think your inspiration was key, and then your guiding hand, and Julie Cook as well. You then have just allowed us to get on with the job, and we're very, very grateful for the freedom that you gave us to do that. It did take us longer than we thought we were going to do. In the meantime, my hair grew compared with the picture on the report, but it wasn't quite that long in delay. The picture is a little bit of an old one, but yeah, we've done our best to we've done our absolute best to put forward a report that can be useful. And before I get to the presentation, which I think Fionn is going to load up now and share, I just want to make it clear again that this report is a report that raises more questions than it answers. We do make recommendations, some recommendations, but We are very conscious of the fact that the position on devolution itself is something for the Wales TUC and union affiliates to agree afterwards. So we offer this report as a starting point for discussion rather than the end state. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Okay, so just a little bit about what we brought with us to the report. We did have a completely free hand to do this research. Wonderful support from Wales TUC, but no interference whatsoever. And we tried to come to the report with no personal baggage about devolution per se. I certainly brought my past experience of research in the international sector on in the clothing sector internationally, where we see grand statements about what can be done for workers and then nothing on the ground, or less than nothing on the ground. So we came to this very determined to look at the realities of work rather than what we would like it to look like. And we tried to be as objective and rigorous in our analysis as our resources and time would allow. And the first thing, of course, that we looked at was, well, there's a huge amount of research that is already on the shelf around work in Wales. We know what good work looks like. We know what research has been done. And so why is it when we have some excellent policy statements that work on, work for many, many workers is not what we are aspiring to? And the reports that are on the shelf at the moment, a range of different analysis, a range of different documents, it just serves to highlight that there's a gulf between regulatory intentions and practical implementation. And workers identify this. And this is a challenge for the labour movement, we feel, because you can't keep telling workers that they're going to be better off, or they already are better off, when they don't feel that. And so this enforcement gap is something that we highlight in the report. Next slide, please. So what did we do? We cast our net wide, and this is why reporting actually took us a lot longer. We surveyed altogether about 3,500 workers at different points in time. I have to thank Joe Allen and Nisreen Mansour of the Wales TUC, or policy officers, for the detail of their experience of policy in Wales and implementation of policy in Wales. They brought together, their knowledge of existing powers, the way agreements work, but above all, they brought diligence, patience with me, and rigor to the whole process. And this report wouldn't have been possible without them. We spoke to key figures in Welsh public life. We had an expert panel who all agreed to be interviewed. The Wales Centre for Public Policy organised a workshop with constitutional experts. The Wizard Research Unit researchers there, Professor Alan Felsted and Rhys Davis, helped us in constructing surveys that could be comparable over time. And we undertook interviews with a range of workers at their workplaces and on picket lines. So we did cast our net wide, and we also looked at reports, union reports, and past reports by academics and practitioners alike. Next slide, please. So when you look at this document, you're not seeing everything we did in the report itself. It's a summary, hopefully a readable summary, and it doesn't undertake or doesn't try to present everything that we did there, all the evidence that we did, because it would be too unwieldy. But if you need to talk about this, and I'm sure you will, then we have all our research ready as a supplementary contribution to the ongoing debate. When we talked to workers themselves, there was general support for devolution. But as Shavanah mentioned at the beginning, we didn't find any great bottom-up push for more devolved powers over the regulation of employment rights. I think that's probably because the workers that we surveyed may not have seen the connection between devolution and employment rights. That may be something that the labour movement will need to consider, because when asked about work, workers responded very much on the basis of either their employer, their sector, or their workplace. And that's why you don't see lots and lots of quotes in the report that we've presented, because we were not confident that we were giving any more than a tiny little snapshot in time with the qualitative comments that workers made. They were either very happy, or if they were on the picket line, they were very unhappy. One key thing that came through, I think quite strongly though, was the distance that workers do feel from real source of influence and power, even where strong unions, you know, relatively strong union presence, for example, in the post office, workers were saying employers just don't want to negotiate with us any longer. They're casting us one side, and that's a factor. That sort of disenchantment and disenfranchisement is something that we need to take account of. Next slide, please. So we looked at where, knowing that the Welsh Government does not have a control over, does not have powers over employment rights outside agriculture, we looked at the arenas of influence that the Welsh Government currently has. It's a quasi-employer in devolved public sector employment. It's a funder of employment. It's a custodian for employability and skills, and it is a strategic influencer and regulator of other legal instruments such as social partnership and procurement, modern slavery, and the body driving the elimination of the pay gap for gender, disability and ethnicity. So there are arenas of influence, but again, this is not a straightforward or a line. These are not lines of influence that can be taken for granted. And I'll return to that in terms of collective bargaining structures. But there are these areas of influence. And perhaps one of the conclusions that we drew when we were doing our research is that within these arenas of influence, more could be being done right now. Next slide, please. So if we focus on partnership and the climate for industrial relations in Wales, we felt that this was probably, you know, this is an area to build on and to celebrate, because there is arguably already a different climate for industrial relations in Wales, thanks to the efforts of trade unions and the Wales TUC. The Social Partnership and Procurement Act is a testament to to good intentions by the Welsh Government. What we would question on the basis of our research is the depth and scope of that partnership and the depth of influence that can be exerted over employers. We have failings in our labour market, high precarity, low pay, low skill, which are related to industrial policy as well as other factors. But these conditions are not only inescapable, they are persistent. If we'd been giving this presentation 10 years ago or 20 years ago, or arguably 30 years ago, we'd be saying the same things. So when we look at and accepting that social partnership is in its infancy in Wales, maybe at the moment public sector unions, you know, have stronger relationships and stronger influence to bring to bear in comparison with unions that are in low skill, low paid sectors of in the private sector. It's all a moot point, and we can't see how deep this partnership is and how far the influence extends into the private sector, where trade union membership is much lower. And this has implications for the public sector because of the increased devolution and outsourcing of public need to private sector provision. Next slide. Then we looked at difficulties around collective bargaining structures. So looking at the whole context for whatever change we might be able to make, many workers in Wales do not work under terms and conditions that are agreed within or for Wales, depending on the sector that they're in. And even within the areas of influence we've listed, even within the collective bargaining structures that relate to those arenas of influence, there are agreements that exclude some bargaining units within the same sector, and lots of different factors which limit the Welsh Government's influence. And not least among those factors would be resource. So where collective bargaining is present in the private sector, the agreements are generally UK-wide. And we have to take account that if this technological green revolution that we all wish to see happens, Wales is likely to be more tied into international networks. And that has implications for at what level you bargain and who you bargain with. Next slide, please. So the questions that come from looking at the evidence is how far we may have a distinctive climate for industrial relations in Wales, to the extent that the government is prepared to sit down and talk to unions and sees unions as, you know, having a legitimate place at the bargaining table, which is in contrast to the UK government over the last many years. So how far are we using Welsh distinctiveness to actively promote collective representation, educate workers about workplace democracy, and enforce rights that currently exist under the current settlement? To what extent do conditions of work across public and private sectors align with this social partnership ethos? What are the risks for you know, standards of work where a lot of public need is being outsourced to private provision, and there's a lot of fragmentation of services? What is the risk there for hollowing out principles as they are practiced across both sectors if we don't have universal standards? And how could further devolved powers to regulate employment rights be brought into line with current bargaining structures? And finally, the big question is what resource would be available to support change? So we're very much aware that we're raising questions that we haven't fully answered, but these are the questions we believe form a basis for future discussion. Next slide, please. So our first principles that lead to our conclusion: social partnership is a good thing. It's to be applauded. But we need, at the Welsh level, a clearer lens on work and employment in relation to social and economic policy across all areas in Wales. So if you're thinking about housing, if you're thinking about transport, if you're thinking about a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit, you have to think about access to work. We contend that enforcement is weak and we could be doing more now under the current settlement than we are, and we see that as an urgent need. We also contend that regulation without resource risks being, little more than a hollow shell and raising false expectations, and that is something that is to be avoided. Current bargaining structures may need to change, but the benefits that they bring must be protected from erosion in any future settlement. And we need in Wales to raise expectations of what work can provide in terms of social and economic betterment for people who are working. It's a scandal that many children in poverty are in households now where both parents are in paid work. Next slide. So to come to our recommendations, we try to make them achievable and meaningful. We do believe that in the Welsh Cabinet, there should be a Minister for Work and Employment or Minister for Labour, somebody that brings a lens on employment and workplace democracy to all areas of social and economic policy. We believe that enforcement needs to be strengthened, and in terms of something that can be done now in the short term, we have laid out proposals for a contained area of increase in labour inspection. We do believe there should be a programme of education around employment rights and industrial relations, not only for workers, but also for all workers, not only for workers generally, but also for people working in the public sector who are responsible for administering social partnership. And we think that using collective bargaining rates as a benchmark for all areas of terms and conditions should now be used across all areas of the devolved public sector. The UK government is notoriously secretive about labour rights and conditions. We think Wales could show a distinctive leadership there by being open and engaging in targeted research and analysis on labour rights and devolution. And we do feel that we should start now before, in the present moment, to test rhetoric against reality and to look at the Fair Work Commission from the bottom up. What difference is it making to workers' awareness of their rights? And finally, I start where I finish where I began, by saying that this is not the end of some sort of discrete project. It was a task that where we were given freedom to think and consider a range of different options. And we finish, we present the report for discussion, and we do feel that in arriving at a coherent view for the labour movement in Wales, the Wales TUC could now establish a working group to examine the full implications of devolution of employment rights to the Welsh Government. And on that, I will end. I hope I haven't taken too much time.
Diolch, Jean. Thank you very much. I think those 7 principles really, and the reality of some of the challenges, I think, thanks for setting those out. And as you say, there's been lots of conversations that have taken place with a number of different workers in a variety of different sectors and settings and work settings, including those who have been on strike as well and been on picket lines. So, diolch yn fawr for all of your work there as well. Next, I'd like to invite Darren Williams, PCS National Officer, to sort of provide us with some of his take and a bit of a insight in terms of what we've discussed today, some of the recommendations, and also to kind of hear. I mean, Darren is one of those people that has been very much at the forefront of devolution. When we talk about the clear red water in particular, Darren is a big part of that story for Wales. So I'm really interested to hear what Darren has got to say next. Thanks, Darren.
Thanks, Shavanah. I'm very pleased to be able to contribute to this discussion on behalf of PCS, a union that's had a long commitment to democratic devolution. Our predecessor unions campaigned for a Welsh Assembly in the 1997 referendum, and we also backed the Yes campaign in the 2011 referendum on primary lawmaking powers. And I think that support's been vindicated by developments throughout the 25 years now of devolved government in Wales. Our members in the devolved sector, while we've had our differences with the Welsh Government and devolved employers at times, our members have had better treatment in the Welsh devolved sector than those in the Whitehall sector in terms of pay and conditions, and also our ability as a trade union to defend and uphold their rights. More broadly, I think, as the report says, the Welsh Government has created an industrial relations climate that respects and engages trade unions, as well as taking a more humane and progressive approach to government generally. So the general trend, I think, over the 25 years of democratic devolution has broadly been in a positive direction. However, at the same time, particularly in the last couple of years, we seem to have seen a regression in politics at the UK level, with renewed austerity, demonisation of refugees and migrants, the use of culture war rhetoric in general, and restrictions on the right to protest, and of course now particularly attacks on trade union rights. So the future certainly seems uncertain, and in that sense this report is very timely. And I do very much welcome Professor Jenkins's report as a serious attempt to engage with the challenges confronting workers and the trade unions, and with the practicalities of promoting a fairer economy through devolution. I think the report rightly emphasises the complexities of the situation and the interaction between the accumulation of legislative powers, the capacity to implement those powers, and the ability of unions to use powers to the advantage of their members. I think all of us who've been involved in the discussions around the introduction of the Social Partnership and Public Procurement Act will appreciate that there is a legal and constitutional minefield when there is any attempt to change the devolution settlement in any way. But I do think the current situation looks more positive in the light of historical context. Devolved government, has grown in its practical influence on people's lives and in the public support it's enjoyed. It took nearly 30 years from the time that a Parliament for Wales was first proposed in the 1950s until the Welsh people had the opportunity to vote on a proposal in 1979. And of course, that referendum was heavily defeated by a margin of 4-1 throughout Wales, in fact. 18 years later, on the other hand, we saw a second referendum deliver a yes vote, albeit by a very slender margin. But I think the big factor in the sea change in public opinion between 1979 and 1997 was the influence of Thatcherism, when people across Wales saw the destruction of much of our coal, steel and manufacturing industries by the policies of a UK government for whom most of them had never voted and against which they had no protection at an all-Wales level. When there was a further referendum in 2011, which I mentioned earlier, on primary lawmaking powers, the proposal was carried much more comfortably, suggesting that, again, in 12 years, there had been a change in opinion as people had had experience of the Assembly and had seen the positive benefits. And that kind of bears out Ron Davies's famous comment that devolution is a process rather than an event. And of course, that change has continued to take place in more recent years as we've seen lawmaking and tax raising powers embedded and put into practice. And we've seen the Welsh Government make a real difference in areas like agricultural wages, in disapplying the worst aspects of the 2016 UK Trade Union Act, and things like taking the Wales and the Borders rail franchise into public ownership when private provision collapsed. And of course, its response to the COVID pandemic, which was much more coherent, consistent and science-based than the UK government's approach, and which involved consulting unions and other social partners, at every step of the way. So in this context, I think the results of the surveys of workers that are presented in the report are encouraging to the extent that they suggest there is more support for Welsh Government control in policy areas which are already devolved, such as health and education, where workers have seen beneficial consequences. And even in employment rights, where the Welsh Government, as Professor Jenkins has said, has virtually no responsibility at present, and there's no immediate prospect of that changing, opinion is almost evenly split, which suggests that if there were a positive campaign in support of the prospect of further devolution, then actually support for that idea could increase. Now, what the report asks, which, as Professor Jenkins has said, is whether we should be deploying our energies in that way, in campaigning for that further change, especially if, in fact, it's ultimately industrial strength in negotiations that will have more influence on the well-being of workers in Wales rather than further legislative change. And in fact, the report suggests that there is a danger that if industrial bargaining strength is fractured by a change in the legislative capability, which would give the Welsh Government more control over employment rights. Now, hopefully, there is a change of UK government on the horizon in the relatively near future, even if we now have to wait until the autumn for that to happen. And Labour is still promising a new deal for working people. I think we need to manage our expectations about exactly what that would entail, given that the Labour leadership currently seems to be backtracking on some of its commitments. But any change of government along the lines that we all expect and hope for can only be positive for workers. However, I think the point needs to be made that the political pendulum at a UK level will inevitably swing back the other way, back to the right in due course. I'll be 54 in a couple of weeks' time, and for 36 of those 54 years, 2/3 of my lifetime, the UK has been ruled by Conservative and Conservative-led governments, with Labour only in office for the remaining 18 years. So any gains secured under the next Labour government, unfortunately, are all too vulnerable to being fairly easily and quickly reversed when there is a further change of government. In Wales, on the other hand, where the political centre of gravity is further to the left, and where there is a progressive consensus on issues like public services, social partnership and trade union rights, gains that favour working people are more likely to become permanent. So I think pragmatic considerations tend to reinforce the basic democratic argument acknowledged in the report that decision-making should be brought as close as possible to the people affected. I would add that a future Welsh Government with the power to raise minimum standards in employment rights for all workers in Wales could also provide a positive example that would help unions negotiating elsewhere in the UK to put pressure on employers to match those advances. Hence, there is an argument that ultimately what workers in Wales need most from a UK Labour government is an extension of responsibilities devolved to the Senedd and the Welsh Government to provide protection against future UK governments attacking and undermining their rights. But I would also add that the report makes a very important point, which again, Jean has mentioned in her presentation, in linking legislative capacity with the resources necessary to make effective use of that capacity. And unions in Wales should also be putting pressure on the next Westminster government to ensure adequate financial support accompanies any additional powers, and that in keeping with the long-standing Wales TUC policy, there is radical reform of the Barnett formula to ensure that Wales receives the funding it needs to support its people and deliver effective public services. So finally, looking at the report's recommendations, I think these are all certainly worthy of support as measures that could enhance the Welsh Government's ability to influence the world of work in Wales in modest but positive ways. I particularly welcome the final recommendation to establish a Wales TUC working group to look at the practicalities of employment rights devolution to Wales. But I would also go further and advocate that alongside that work, the Wales TUC should make a positive case for further devolution in this area, in keeping with the general positive approach to devolution that Shavanah, you set out in your foreword to the report, to make use of the opportunities that present themselves now, both coming out of the commission that the Welsh Government has established, which is due to report next week, the greater interest in and support for various constitutional options such as radical federalism and even independence, but also the fact that, as I've mentioned, we are hoping and expecting a change of government at a UK level in the very near future. So I think in the same way that trade unions in Wales helped to make the case in the 1980s and 90s for devolution as a kind of bulwark against the more reactionary policies of Westminster governments, I think the Wales TUC and Welsh unions could now play a positive role in leading public opinion in Wales and being ambitious for the possibility of further constitutional change to benefit workers rather than being constrained unduly by where public opinion is today.
Diolch, Darren. You've definitely given us plenty of food for thought and actually given me some ideas for our upcoming Congress in May as well. As you say, this is really a starter for the movement. We've got lots of conversations that we need to have, and that working group I think is going to be really key in moving some of this discussion forward. There's been lots of discussion and all sorts of exchanges in the chat boxes as well that I can see. So please keep posting your Q&A. But next, I'd like to invite Richie Lewis from UNISON to give his insight and some of his thoughts as well. Again, UNISON, like PCS and many of the other Welsh unions, have played a key part in the journey of devolution to date, including, of course, pushing for legislative changes such as the social partnership and procurement legislation more recently. So, Richie, over to you.
Thanks, Shavanah. Hi, everyone. So, yes, thank you, first of all, to Professor Jenkins and the Commission for the work. It's really excellent and well-researched and reasoned assessment, I think, of work and industrial relations in Wales. Thanks also to the Wales TUC for the invitation today. I have to say, when I was first invited to contribute on this panel, my first thought was, where do you start trying to break this down? So much of what the report contains intersects with questions of politics, of the constitution of the UK, citizenship issues around empowerment, education, and democracy as itself, as a concept, I think. Parts 1 and 2 of the report, I think, really illustrate how complex this situation is. And that's actually one of my favorite things about this report. It's really thorough in its overview of the legislation, the issues of devolution, who's responsible for what and where, what do workers think and how much do they currently know? And it really discusses the problems that Wales has with poverty, deprivation, low-skilled, low-pay, insecure work. And I think all of that is really vital. It's an invaluable contribution, actually, to the debate about the future of Wales, because this report, as Professor Jenkins says, is asking more questions than simply proposing simple solutions and offering them up as a panacea, which I think we should all be wary about. If we are serious about wanting to lift people out of poverty and to improve work and have a healthier, better Wales for people to live and work in, then the contributions to this debate around devolution and the Constitution and Wales's place in it have to be nuanced and skeptical of people who are offering up any kind of simple solution. So I think that's the report does a really good job of emphasizing that. On the industrial relations climate, I think much of what the report focuses on as a public service trade union, we can identify with and corroborate as well. We do notice in Wales a distinct difference in the climate in which industrial relations are conducted. But I think there are actually reasons beyond the fact that the UK government is more hostile than the Welsh government on this issue. One of the primary reasons for that is that it's often the case that the current devolution settlement means that the Welsh government is too often responsible without power, and it does not have the levers to pull or release principally funding or act within its current legislative competence. And that presents an issue for us as trade unions, where it can lead to a degree of pacification of our campaigns, where you're in dispute with Welsh Government over a devolved public sector issue, such as pay, and you're met with a Welsh Government that says, well, in principle, we agree with you, but we can't do anything until Westminster move on this. That's clearly not an ideal situation for any actor, whether that's the trade union making the claim, not for employers, not for trade union members, and actually, to be fair to Welsh Government, not to them either, whose legislative and strategic agenda is more progressive, but is actually impeded as well. But it actually holds more questions about the indication of how healthy our democracy is when you have a government that is elected in Wales and is waiting on others to act, and it can use that to its advantage in certain situations, but to be fair, not all the time. I think the themes that the report identifies in its analysis, I would assume are familiar to all of us who are here today, but I think I'd like to make a dishonorable addition to something that's in the report, and that is about the contribution towards this of the lack of proper governance of the whole of the UK since 2016. We have been at Westminster and Whitehall level in a state of turbulence that leads to degrees of paralysis. It's treated democratically elected governments in the rest of the UK with contempt. They've treated devolution with a degree of contempt, and has become more interested in involving itself in culture wars than actually governing, as Darren mentioned earlier. So I think it's something worth mentioning there. There's been actually very little proper governance going on at Westminster, which has not helped the situation at all. On equality, the equality aspect and education, I think it does invite us to look at this through a gendered lens as well. I think the report does a good job of that. Poor work and pay exists for all people in Wales, but there are definitely those who are worse off than others. Looking at care work, for example, where we have a strong membership, it's a predominantly female workforce on insecure work, low pay, no trade union presence or little trade union presence, certainly no collective bargaining rights. And it's hard not to make the conclusion that because the ethics and performance of care are historically performed by women at home and therefore unpaid, it follows that the societal norms will historically undervalue care when it comes to professionalizing it and remunerating people for that. So I think that's a direct consequence of our history, really. And I think it's important to note also, as the report mentions, that this report really does make clear that it is actually the state that ends up subsidizing poorly paid work. If employers don't raise the floor in terms of pay, terms and conditions, it's the state that picks up the slack for that. There is very little saving to be made, which indicates that these are ideological choices or choices made to the benefit of a small number. There are really legitimate questions about their education system, and the report teases that out as well. And I think we do need to be doing more about empowering young people to get them to know more about the world of work, to know how to affirm their rights and what they are. And I think it's worth mentioning the excellent TUC pilot, actually, the Wales TUC pilot on unions into schools. I hope that will be the start of something much more positive. Just to finish on the recommendations, I mean, we have to put everything to our members, but we would be supportive of any initiatives or recommendations that seek to address the issues that this report has expounded on. On recommendation 3, I think there is a responsibility for us as a trade union movement to educate and train our lay activists as well in the principles and functions of social partnership so that they can discharge our duties properly. And that actually goes back into recommendation 2 then, which means that there does need to be greater enforcement from Welsh Government to foster a better industrial relations climate at the local level, because you can have these top-down views, but actually, rather than trickle down, bad relations tend to trickle up in industrial relations. So there is a historical power imbalance there. If the Welsh Government can enforce these things better and foster a better climate at a regional level, then we stand a better chance of social partnership being a success. And on recommendation 4, I just want to stress really how vital collective and sectoral bargaining is to uplifting workers' pay terms and conditions in Wales. I mean, where we already have it, we can't afford to take it for granted. And it's in all of our collective interest to preserve those and be as strategically aligned as a trade union movement to that principle. I think that it is too easy to think that things could be better done, or to throw things away and reinvent things, rather than preserving what we have and accepting things aren't perfect, but we can make them better. And finally, yeah, we really look forward to the Independent Commission's report on the constitutional future of Wales next week. I'm really glad that's coming next week. UNISON's view on that is that, as the report says, we're aligned that simply having more devolution is not an answer in and of itself. The current status quo is not working for Wales and its people either. So however which way this small island is politically constituted, unilaterally going it alone sometimes might well have the opposite effects of your best intentions. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Diolch, Richie, and thanks to all our panelists and to Jean as well. So the next bit really is we've got some questions for our panel members. There's all sorts of stuff that's been posted in the chat box, but also in the Q&A box as well. Lots of interesting things specifically in relation to kind of Welsh Government powers, whether or not they have certain powers to do certain things, and some of our panelists have mentioned that as well. Lots of discussion about the Barnett consequentials, whether or not the current settlement works, whether that needs to change, whether the Welsh Government tax raising powers need to change to match, for example, the Scottish Government's ability to set tax allowance bands, and that this would enable us to raise sufficient revenue to actually enforce and be more independent from Westminster. Of course, budget constraints has been mentioned a few times as well. The fact that actually lots of really positive things about the report itself as well. There is something that I wanted to just to point to a couple of questions. And there's one in particular that I think is important because it goes back to some of the things that have already been mentioned in terms of where Welsh Government does have the power to change things. Do they have the confidence to push ahead to make some of those changes? So one of the questions here is from Alan Felsted, where he says, even when Welsh Government has influence and can make change, this does not always happen. The agricultural wages order has not changed despite the Fair Work Commission's recommendations to do so. And given this, how confident are you that the changes you recommend will be taken up and importantly make a difference? And that's to Jean. And then also a similar sort of question really that comes from Steve Davis as well, where he says, one question that he has for you, Jean, is, could you say a little bit more about where you had that call for openness and how that could be used to the benefit of workers at the workplace? So if we can start with those, and then we'll take some others.
Okay, well, on the first question that you pose first is, what confidence have we got that what we suggest can make a difference? We've been deliberately modest in our recommendations and sort of demands out of this report, because we do think that some of these initiatives could be done. Some of the things like labour inspection are on the Welsh Government agenda anyway. Whether it can make a difference is the key thing. Most of my life, my other academic life, is dealing with the sector, the clothing sector, where pronouncements do not make a difference and are shown not to make a difference. I think the credibility of the social partnership agenda is something that has to be leveraged here, because if it is to mean anything, it should mean that action is taken. So I think maybe linking modest demands to ongoing regulatory commitments would be a way to exert some pressure, some expectation. How much confidence do I have? I do think that a Minister for Work would be a good form of pressure. But our democratic role here as citizens, as trade unionists, as voters, is that we have to bring pressure to bear now, because change must come. It really must come. I mean, what Darren was saying about, and what Richie was saying, about the contempt that devolution has been held in, and the chaos in governance that we've experienced, it's time for a change. And I think people are realizing that it's gone too far. In terms of more openness, perhaps I could give the example of the level of outsourcing within the public sector, the level of outsourcing, the degree to which working conditions are transparent within different sectors. You know, we have private sector provision within the public sector. We have no real idea what people are being paid. We have no real idea what sort of conditions they're working in because they're hidden within the workplace. So I think a more active and, you know, a more active government-led form of monitoring and publication of rates of pay, of benchmarking, of holding people to account if they have public money, for example. You know, if public money is being spent to support certain sectors or certain industries, how are they responding to the issue of employment rights and workers' rights? That should all be a reporting requirement. And so there are many different initiatives that we can look at, but they could be done without disrupting too much. Just a requirement to report. And then you need, again, it comes to resource. You don't just want lots and lots of data. You want data linked to action, linked to inspection. And maybe through bringing those two things together, it could be helpful. Not sure I've answered either question terribly well, but.
Thanks, Diolch, Jean. There was another question that I'll bring over to Darren, and it came from Mike Payne. He starts by thanking Jean for her presentation, always insightful and inspirational. The question is specifically around the challenge of devolving employment legislation, but how do we ensure that we get our own judiciary to ensure enforcement? So, you know, how does that happen in reality? And of course, we've discussed sort of collective bargaining and some of the centrally agreed collectively bargain agreements, etc. So, Darren, that one for you.
Yeah, well, I think that's a very good point that Mike makes there. And of course, you know, the Welsh Government is committed to push for devolution of justice and policing. It'd be interesting to see what the Independent Commission has to say about that when it reports next week. But you know, I think we just need to get behind that demand, really. I mean, certainly from the experience that we have in PCS of the way that the justice system is administered by the UK government, there's certainly plenty of room for improvement, to put it mildly, and that's just in terms of operational matters, but you know, from a point of view of democracy and being able to have, you know, some meaningful influence over justice in Wales, and obviously that that legislation needs to happen. I mean, the Gordon Brown report was broadly positive, you know, on that area, although, you know, he recommends a cautious approach starting with probation and youth justice. But I think hopefully, given the influence that seems to have had on the Labour leadership, if we do have a change of government later this year, then that legislation can be taken forward.
Diolch, Darren. And Richie, I will ask the following for you. So it's in relation to almost a comment question from Sarah Murphy, MS for Bridgend. She has posted up, thank you so much for organising this event today. Excellent report, great recommendations. Particularly agree with the need for a Welsh Government Minister for this brief to drive the Fair Work agenda. Deputy Minister for Social Partnership role could be transformed into this. She specifically makes reference to the fact that it should really talk about, we should be talking about work and an innovation minister, particularly to incorporate the crucial role that trade unions and workers play in coming up with solutions. And of course, technological changes, advancements, AI, etc., would all need to be there. And she talks about workplace surveillance in particular. Now, Richie, you talked about social care. And we've often talked about some of the challenges around those workers in particular not being protected by collectively bargained agreements, particularly those who are working in the private part of social care as well. Do you think that with us having more having this sort of like a new role of a minister, we then have the Welsh Government commitment of having enforcement officers? And of course, like Jean says, we have then a mechanism whereby it's not just data gathering, but it's actually action. Do you think that that will actually make a difference for workers, particularly in social care, for example? Do you think that that could help change things?
Thanks, Shav. Well, in the first instance, you would hope so. All those changes would be broadly positive, and we would welcome them. But there are, I mean, so much of what the issues are with social care does come down essentially to funding. I mean, UNISON is committed to a national care service and improving collective bargaining rights in that sector. We think that is the best way to improve the pay terms and conditions, and just the way that the perception of that sector is viewed in Wales and across the UK. UNISON is actually campaigning for that across the whole of the UK, but we are further ahead in Wales because the Welsh Government is a bit more progressive on that. So I think some of the measures you mentioned there would be a step in the right direction, but it would be a slow turnaround in change. On your point around sort of innovation in work, though, and a work and innovation minister, as Sarah mentioned, I think that would be a really good start. I mean, the Welsh Government's commitment to net zero is holding far more water than what's happening in Westminster at the moment. And I think net zero really is, if the opportunity could be grasped to really reset the labour force in Wales and the way that we look at work, and the change the low skill, low wage economy that we have into a high skilled one. And going back to Professor Jenkins' report around employers don't base themselves in Wales here. All of the decision making is outside of Wales, and therefore the work here is fragmented and temporary and can be moved elsewhere if supply chains demand it for profit. And net zero represents a chance to really change that, and I think a work and innovation minister to oversee that process and drive that along would be transformational across all sectors. It would have an impact on the public sector as well. There is work to be done in integrating AI into our labour force that would, as the market changes because of net zero and AI, there are still certain jobs which can only be performed by humans, and care is one of those functions, and social care would be one of the beneficiaries of doing this change well. So I think a minister that would oversee that would be wholly beneficial. Yeah.
Diolch, Richie. Right, I am conscious of the fact that it is now 1 p.m. So I'm just going to just touch on very quickly some of the comments that have been made again in the chat box. Lots of discussion about the learning from the Norwegians, some of the learning that we have done as the Wales TUC as well, where we held a summer patrol. And the question really about whether or not Wales TUC is looking at something similar, whereby we have enforcement officers, enforcement workers and unions working more closely together, and having that sort of legal team reporting things in, prosecuting bad employers, etc. Again, I think that, these are good ideas. Our working group will pick up on much of this. So there's going to have to be a lot of granular detail, a lot of planning that would have to go into something like this. Lots of discussion about the fact that sometimes the public, including workers, think that Wales is too small. That comes from Sian Gale, our incoming president, that Wales is too small and poor to take on such responsibility. However, the UK, being the 5th or 6th richest in the world, hasn't benefited working people. Other comments about how we shouldn't underestimate what we can do, that sometimes apathy can be so rampant, and of course other comments about creating a more inclusive Wales and what we can do. And again, there's a lot of this report refers back to the Fair Work Commission and some of the recommendations that were there, and builds upon some of that. So moving forward, what we will now do is this is a starting point for us, really. I ask each and every one of you to share this report with others. We are going to be, there's going to be some further blogs, there's going to be lots of other things that follow today as well. And of course, we will be holding our Congress in May this year, where this issue is definitely going to be a big one that our General Council will be debating in the coming months as well. So diolch yn fawr, everybody, for joining us. A big thank you, of course, to Jean for the report and the recommendations, to our expert panel, to our policy team at the Wales TUC, Joe and Nisreen in particular, who've done a lot of the heavy lifting in supporting this work. and to Julie Cook as well, our National Officer, and also, of course, our tech team, the behind the scenes people who make all of this stuff happen. So diolch yn fawr everybody, and to our design team as well. Diolch yn fawr everybody for joining us, and we look forward to continuing this discussion.